Okay, I've got one announcement actually, I guess really just one to make, but you guys do need to hear this. We are going into fall, and so after family camp there are some changes happening with our Sunday school department, and one of those changes will involve a second adult Sunday school class that will be meeting at this point. I think they're going to try to meet in the sanctuary. And Larry Newman is going to be leading this class. They're going to begin with a survey of the book of Jonah. And so if you have more questions or want more information about that, Larry's right here. So ask Larry about that. And so do you have an exact start date? Is it the first Sunday after family camp? Or okay.
2 weeks from today.
2 weeks from today. All right. Okay, so that's my one announcement that I needed to make. I am going to begin today. Now, there are notes in the back. We have a whole new topic. We're going to spend probably about a month, I think, on this topic, which is the whole issue of climate change. And that's obviously in the news a lot. What I spent a lot of time this week working on, and I don't have the title out here, but working on origins. One of the things that our young people really confront in school is the whole idea that there is no creator, that the world can be explained without God and without the need for God as a creator. And so that's something that going forward, we'll look at climate change, then we'll look at capital punishment. And I want to spend about a month on that issue of contrasting worldviews in terms of origins. Where did this world come from? And how do we best explain the existence of this world? And so I can't think of a more important topic, honestly, particularly for young people who are being bombarded with a very contrary message, I think, within the secular culture. And so there's just a lot of things coming up that we're going to be talking about. Today, climate change, but before we do that, I do want to spend just a couple minutes, and I'm going to start by showing you a video. It's not about climate change, and as you watch it, you'll see what it's about. It's from the Department of Education, and it is basically a video welcoming students back into the public school system for this new year. And as you'll see, it's interesting, and I find it pretty disturbing.
So is this Oregon Department of Education?
No, this is federal.
We're here to help.
I'm Suzanne, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Returning to school can be both exciting and nerve-wracking for many students. Maybe you're starting a new school or returning to in-person learning after a long time away. Maybe you're worried about making friends or keeping up with the challenging new class. If you're a transgender student, perhaps you're worried about simply being accepted and safe and being treated with respect as you head into the new school year. I'm Christian Clark.
Can you all hear that?
No. You got a volume thing right on the bottom there. You can turn that up. And on the bottom left.
Bottom left.
There you go.
Look at the red bar.
Okay, let me start this.
Turn it down and get the glasses out.
Let me start it again and try to get it right.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Goldberg, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Returning to school can be both exciting and nerve-wracking for many students. Maybe you're starting a new school or returning to in-person learning after a long time away. Maybe you're worried about making friends or keeping up with the challenging new class. If you're a transgender student, perhaps you're worried about simply being accepted and safe and being treated with respect as you head into the new school year.
I'm Christian Clark, the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice. We know that many school administrators and educators are doing their best to to make schools safe and welcoming places for all students, including LGBTQI students. We appreciate the work they do. But we also know that that's not the reality for all transgender students, including perhaps some of you. In some places, people in positions of authority are putting up obstacles that would keep you from playing on the sports field, accessing the bathroom, and receiving the supportive and life-saving care you may need. We're here to say that's wrong and it's against the law.
We know that you are resilient, and we hope you will find support where and when you need it. But we also want you to know that the Department of Education and the entire federal government stand behind you. Your rights at school matter. You matter.
The Department of Justice is here, along with the Department of Education, to investigate complaints about discrimination or harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We want you to know that we are looking out for you, and we're here to protect your civil rights.
Hello, I am Dr. Rachel Levine, Assistant Secretary for Health. We know at the United States Department of Health and Human Services that learning environments free from bullying and harassment are vital to making sure that all students flourish, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It is critical to support trans youth, their parents, and families to help them achieve the good health and well-being that everyone deserves.
We have many federal government resources for you. If you face discrimination or harassment at school because you are transgender, you can file a complaint with the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights at ed.gov/OCR. You can also find more information and resources on a dedicated page for LGBTQI+ students at ed.gov/OCR/LGBT. Or just Google LGBTQI+ students and OCR, and you will find your way there.
We want to hear from you. You can file a complaint with the Justice Department at civilrights.justice.gov. The information is available in multiple languages. Discrimination will not be accepted on our watch. Right now, we are fighting against laws that tried to ban transgender athletes in West Virginia and deny health care for transgender young people in Arkansas. And recently, federal courts in both states have blocked those laws from being applied.
Discrimination and bullying have no place in our nation's schools. We all learn better when we are in safe and welcoming environments. If you are being bullied or know someone who is, we encourage you to visit stopbullying.gov for more information and resources. President Biden sent an unequivocal message to the transgender community. Quote, "To all transgender Americans watching at home, especially the young people, I want you to know your president has your back," unquote. Well, I want all of you to know that I have your back too, and I will do everything that I can to support and advocate for our community.
We stand behind you and are ready to act to defend your rights. Best of luck for this next school year.
I join my colleagues in wishing you all the best for an enriching and fulfilling school year.
What's that?
I don't remember the LGBTQ, and several times they mentioned I on the end.
Yeah, what is, there's A, which is ally, there's I, which is intersex, maybe. I mean, the acronym keeps growing, and it will continue to grow.
From the last time I remember the full acronym it was LGBTQAIPFE, which was lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex. Can't remember the other I. Pansexual, feminist, which was silent, and environmental, like it was some type of like pathologist, like somebody who believes that they're part of the group. That was the last time I remember it. And it was just...
Well, at any rate, I shared that with you because it confirms a lot of things that we've talked about, and I haven't honestly had a lot of pushback from the things in this class, although I have had a little bit. And the pushback I have received has been in the realm of this isn't real and this is scaremongering. So to listen to the Department of Education representing the Obama administration say the things that you just listened to, and did you hear those things? What specifically stood out to you? There were 3 things, at least, that stood out to me. If you're a transgender student, which bathroom can you use? The one you choose. If you want to use, which locker room can you use? Anyone you identify with. What sport team can you play on? And I don't know about you, but when I listen to that, in my mind I'm thinking the Department of Education and the Justice Department of the United States, they're looking for cases to prosecute.
Yeah.
That's one of the takeaways I had from that, is that these are people who are on a crusade. They're on a crusade, and they're wanting you to reach out so that they can go after individuals. And so it just affirms a lot of the things we've looked at. And so you have Senator Merkley, for instance, responding to the Equality Act and saying this is an overreaction, these things won't happen. No, that simply isn't accurate. It isn't true. It isn't honest. So I don't want to get too wrapped up in this because I do want to get to climate change, but I will take Maria, raise her hand, and what's your name? David, raise his hand. Sorry, David. So go ahead.
I don't think that anyone quibbles with the fact, especially as Christ followers, that no one should be bullied. And so we all agree with that. Everyone should be treated with respect and love. But boys whooping on the girls on the sports team isn't bullying. That's just kind of common sense. So I treat people kindly and respectfully, yes. Throw a grade up and then no.
Yes, I think it's important to understand what that video is saying. It's not saying that if you struggle with your gender that the school will find a restroom to meet your needs. It's not saying that. It's saying that if you're, for instance, biologically male and you identify as female, that every other female in that school will have to give way to you. And you can play on the sports teams and you will dominate. And the girls in the school have no rights in this situation. So the transgender students' rights overrule all other rights. And I would personally think that a fair-minded person could say that that's simply not fair. That's not right. If we're going to have this category of transgender, then really we need to accommodate that in some way, but it shouldn't be at the expense of all the other students in the school.
It's important to clarify that as Christ followers, we're called to love well. So the kids that are really struggling and confused and hurting, we should absolutely be reaching out and loving to them.
Yes, but we cannot be silent.
Yes, not.
We cannot be silent because I just don't think that's an option for us. Yeah, David?
You just addressed what I was going to say was, if they're saying we're trying to bully against transgenderism or whatever, them trying to push their agenda against female athletes and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
To me, like it's bullying against the female athletes, and they're taking away all of their scholarships, their awards, whatever. It's not fair.
Yeah, this has real life consequences for other people, and it's hurtful for other people. Yes. Now, one other thing, if you read the East Oregonian this is Saturday, August 21st, so just over a week ago, on the front page there was a major article entitled Transgender Native American Teen Speaks Out. Anybody see that article? And so this is someone who lives over in Mission, and the story is about a transgender girl, so it's a biological boy, who became prom princes. And there's a picture of his family, or her family, or this person's family, and a very long article. Starts on the front page and goes into additional page as well. And it's very interesting. If you had access to it, it's a good thing to read it. And I won't get into all of that today, but I will say this, towards the end of the article, after going through this person's experience in their life and what happened to them as a child and so forth, this young person says, for instance, this person says, I'm sorry, this person is biologically male, so it violates my conscience to call this person a female.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can disagree with me on that, but it does, because I believe that God made this person male. And so I'm deeply troubled by even referring to the person as female. I try to refer to the person as a person made in the image of God with value and dignity. This person talks about suicide attempts. So clearly there are real issues that this individual is struggling with. But one thing that stood out to me, there's a picture on the front page, and this biological male, the face is very painted, with cosmetics and so forth. His mother comes up to his shoulder. He looks like he's 3 or 4 inches taller than his father. This is a big person. And at the end of this, the individual says, I am so looking forward to going back to school and playing basketball. Okay, now Stanfield plays this team in a non-league context. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's a reminder to me that a lot of these issues, they're right here in our own community. And just based on the physicality of this individual, who, by the way, is not on cross-sex hormones, has not had any surgical procedures done. This person is physically a prime male. But it sounds like the intention here is to play on the girls' high school team. So they would come to Stanfield, and that's the world we're living in. So we'll set that aside for today. And obviously we spent lots and lots of time with that topic, and I'm sure we will continue to cycle back to it. But climate change and radical environmentalism, that is our notes. And I want to begin today by confessing that I am absolutely not an expert on this topic. I am not a trained scientist, and so that's a disclaimer going in. I have done quite a bit of reading on this, particularly in years past. If you go in my library, back before Kindle and digital books, I have more digital books now than I have actual books on my shelves. But I do have 10 books or so on climate change, and so I've done some reading, but some of the details of the science, I'm not really qualified to address all of those issues. But I want to start with just this category of climate change fears, because there is an awful lot of fear in our culture today on these issues. And I want to begin by reading a statement to you. It's a paragraph, and so just listen as I read these words and see if they sound contemporary to you. They're representative. So this person states, talking about our world and resources being used up and so forth, he says, everything has been visited, everything known, everything exploited. And so what he's saying is that there are human beings everywhere, and they're exploiting the resources of this world. He says, what were previously pleasant estates have been obliterated. The famous wilderness areas of the past have been destroyed. Plowed fields have replaced forests. Domesticated animals have dispersed wildlife. Beaches are plowed up, mountains are smoothed down, and swamps are drained. There are as many cities in former years, there are as many cities as in former years there were dwellings. Everywhere there are buildings, everywhere people, everywhere communities, everywhere life. Proof of this crowding is the density of human beings. We weigh upon the world. Its resources hardly suffice to support us. As our needs grow larger, so do our protests that already nature does not sustain us. In truth, plague, famine, wars, and earthquakes must be regarded as a blessing to civilization, since they prune away the luxuriant growth of the human race. Now, does that sound contemporary?
Thomas Malthus.
That's not Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was an Anglican clergyman, and we'll talk about him later. He had a theory of depleting resources and so forth. So this could have come from him, but it's not from him. This could have come from someone like AOC, right? I mean, she makes statements like this. She's made statements here. I think according to her prediction, the world will be destroyed. We have about 3 more years, maybe. She made a prediction just a couple of years ago to that effect. But no, this statement is from a church father. It's from a Christian. It's from a Christian theologian. And his name is Tertullian. Have you ever heard of him? When you start reading church fathers, his name comes up, and he was a thinker and a writer. He lived in, well, I mean, this is sort of the middle of his life, AD 200. Okay, now there were some chuckles there. Now you get the point, don't you? What do you think the world's population was in AD 200? Yeah, we can only really guesstimate. The guesstimate that is given is 500 million. What's the population today? It's over 7 billion, right? So, and I don't know, maybe it's 8 billion, I'm not sure. But when the world had 500 million people in the year AD 200, the church father Tertullian wrote this, saying that we are in deep crisis because there are far too many people weighing down upon the world, using up its finite resources. And so this kind of fear that I'm talking about, which is so much a part of this topic, has been with us, it would seem, since almost the beginning, or at least as far back as we can go, to read people who are making statements about climate and environment. And so here's a statement, just one sentence. New York City will be underwater by 2015 if we don't address global warming. Now, who do you think said that? Al Gore in the year 2009. Do you have that in your notes? Do you have Al Gore there? Oh, okay. Here's another one. This is correcting what I said a few moments ago, because I besmirched OcasioCortez. I said she gave us like 3 or 4, 5 years. That's not entirely true. So let me correct the record here. She actually said in the year 2019, she said the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change. And of course, OcasioCortez is a United States representative from New York State. And so according to her, we have 10 years left. And I want to read some other statements. I have an article here, and just spend some time with this. And it goes back to 1970, and then some statements from that point forward. It's entitled 18 Spectacularly Wrong Predictions made around the first Earth Day in 1970, and you should expect more this year. And there have been more this year. The Intergovernmental Panel came out just very recently, within the last couple of weeks, with their latest update, and it is filled with dire predictions of what's going to happen in the world. And by the way, is there climate change? Is that a reality? Yes. Yes. Climate change is a reality. I mean, we're not denying that climate change is a reality. Just look at our geological history. We know climate change happens. But it's why it happens and what it means that is really the issue here. So here's, let me just read some of these. Harvard biologist George Wald estimated that civilization will end within 15 or 30 years unless immediate action is taken against problems facing mankind. So that was in 1970 that he said that. So his outer number was 30 years, so that would bring us to the year 2000. And so this Harvard biologist said that civilization would end by the year 2000. And of course that didn't happen. Here's another quote. We are living in an environmental crisis which threatens the survival of this nation and of the world as a sustainable place for human habitation, wrote Washington University biologist George Commoner in the Earth Day issue of the scholarly journal Environment in the year 1970. So an environmental crisis that threatens the survival of the nation. Here's another statement. Population will inevitably and completely outstrip whatever small increases in food supplies we make. This is Paul Ehrlich in 1970, April 1970. The death rate will increase until at least 100 to 200 million people per year will be starving to death during the next 10 years. Now, did that happen? That did not happen. That was based on the thought that what we were able to grow in terms of food supplies is a static fixed number, and we simply couldn't go beyond that. And so looking at what we could produce in 1970, this scientist extrapolated out based on population growth. We're going to have all these new mouths to feed, and it's going to lead to mass starvation. And that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because of technological progress, right? Farmers were able to produce more. Another quote, most of the people who are going to die in the greatest cataclysm in the history of man have already been born, wrote Ehrlich in a 1969 essay entitled Eco-Catastrophe. By 1975, some experts feel that food shortages will have escalated the present level of world hunger and starvation into famines of unbelievable proportions. Other experts, more optimistic, think the ultimate food population collision will not occur until the decade of the 1980s. Ehrlich sketched out his most alarmist scenario for the 1970 Earth Day issue of the Progressive, assuring readers that between 1980 and 1989, some 4 billion people, including 65 million Americans, would perish in what then was called the Great Die-Off. Now, do I need to read that again? He said that in the decade of the 80s, some 4 million people would die, including 65 million Americans, in the Great Die-Off. Now, if you go back to the 1980s, the world's population was not much more than 4 billion. So this scientist was predicting that the world, virtually the whole population, would die of famine because we would not have the ability to feed people. Do I need to go on? Demographers agree almost unanimously on the following grim timetable. Okay, so what do we have here? We have the experts, the scientists, who are unanimously lockstep agreed that this is what's going to happen. Does that sound familiar to you? Okay. We have all this, the experts say, and the experts know, and the experts are right. So again, demographers agree unanimously on the following grim timetable. By 1975, widespread famine will begin in India. These will spread by 1990 to include all of India, Pakistan, China, and the Near East, and Africa. By the year 2000, or conceivably sooner, South and Central America will exist under famine conditions. By the year 2000, 30 years from now, 20 years in our past, the entire world, with the exception of Western Europe, North America, and Australia, will be in famine. Did any of that happen? No. January 1970, Life magazine, remember Life magazine? Life and Newsweek? They still exist, I guess. Newsweek does. Maybe it is a digital, I don't know if it's a printed thing now or not. But Life magazine, that was Life and Newsweek. When I was in high school, those were the two ones that were the most popular. Scientists, quote, scientists have solid experimental and theoretical evidence to support the following predictions. In a decade, so again, that puts us in the 80s, urban dwellers will have to wear gas masks to survive air pollution. By 1985, air pollution will have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching Earth by 1/2. Now again, Life magazine is not what we would have considered, I didn't consider it back then, as like On the Fringe or some nutty magazine. Life magazine was digested by the average American. Now I do remember I grew up in Portland for a fair number of my early years. Spent some years in grade school living in Portland and then returned to Portland later. I do remember in grade school that you could smell the air on certain days. You remember that? If you lived in a major city. Can you smell the air today in Portland? Not generally. Maybe if there's a fire someplace and the smokes come in. But you know, Portland on certain days, because of pollutants, probably from vehicles for the most part, there was a fair amount of pollution in a city like Portland. Is there less pollution today than there was back then? Yes. By far. It is a far cleaner city in terms of pollution. In terms of homelessness, it's a far dirtier city, and it's a very sad thing. When I lived in Portland as a boy, you didn't see at all the things that you see now. So this is a prediction from Life magazine saying that we'd all be wearing gas masks in the 80s, which was the decade that I was in high school. I mean, a colossal joke. But it was presented as this is what the science tells us. Ecologist Kenneth Watt told the Times, at the present rate of nitrogen buildup, it's only a matter of time before light will be filtered out of the atmosphere and none of our land will be usable. Do you wish we'd had a few more clouds this summer? It's been pretty hot here, hasn't it? And it has been very hot. Barry Commoner predicted that decaying organic pollutants would use up all the oxygen in America's rivers, causing freshwater fish to suffocate. Paul Ehrlich, we've mentioned him before, he chimed in, predicting in 1970 that air pollution is certainly going to take hundreds of thousands of lives in the next few years alone. Ehrlich sketched a scenario in which 200,000 Americans would die in 1973 during smog disasters in New York and Los Angeles. Did that happen? Ecologist Kenneth Watt declared by the year 2000, if present trends continue, we will be using up crude oil at such a rate that there won't be any more crude oil. You'll drive up to the pump and say, fill her up, buddy, and he'll say, I'm sorry, there isn't any more. Did that happen? Why didn't that happen? And why would someone say that back in the 70s? Why did they say in the 70s that by the year 2000 we wouldn't have any gasoline?
We had gas lines.
Because the technology they had in the 1970s would would not carry what we have to use today with our population.
Yeah, there are all sorts of assumptions made in all of these predictions, and the assumptions in this statement is that the amount of oil that we can produce in 1970 will not support a much larger population that will exist, say, in the year 2000. And so therefore, we can confidently predict that there will be an absolute catastrophe and you won't be able to get gasoline for your car. But the fallacy in all of that is it underestimates the ingenuity of the human mind. And that we've developed things such as fracking, and we can drill in the ocean, and we can retrieve sources of oil that in the past it was unthinkable. And we have more proven oil reserves today than we've ever had in human history. And so no one really talks much this way today. Today we're just against oil because it's, it's a pollutant. But again, it was based on an assumption. They're sort of like modeling out. And they're saying because people cannot improve their situation because people lack the right stuff to develop new resources, we're all going to just perish. And it's proven to be, it's just laughable. Harrison Brown, a scientist at the National Academy of Sciences, published a chart in Scientific American. Now, Scientific American, a pretty respected source, more respected than Life or Newsweek, that looked at metal reserves and estimated that humanity would totally run out of copper shortly after the year 2000. Lead, zinc, tin, gold, and silver would be gone before 1990. Now, I have this later in my notes, and I'm not going to try to find it right now, but I actually addressed this issue, and if I forgot that this quote was here, but I would have connected the two. When we get to that, when we have copper reserves that'll take us out for like 5,000 years. I mean, it's stunning. I mean, our oil reserves will take us a few hundred years. So someone could say, boy, we've got to still be a little bit jittery about oil. But a lot of these minerals, I mean, we've got gold. Why is gold so expensive? We got tons of gold. And so here's someone saying that in the year 2000, we'd be in a disaster, by 1990, we'd be in a disaster situation because these minerals, we would have just dug them all up, used them, and trashed the planet, essentially. But again, technology has made that just look foolish. Senator Gaylord Nelson wrote in Look that Dr. S. Dillon Ripley, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institute, believes, again, we got to listen to this person, right? Because they work for the Smithsonian Institute. Have you ever been to Smithsonian on the Capitol Mall, all the museums there? It's a great thing, right? But here we got a person from the Smithsonian. I went into the National Gallery of Art years ago with my wife, and I really enjoyed it, actually. They've got really, very famous artwork there, and I'm not much of I'm pretty ignorant on these things, but I did enjoy it, and you can study these great pieces of art, and you can recognize they really are telling a story. But anyway, we walked in, and there was some person in the front, and he looked official, and he looked like he was somebody. I have no idea who he was. But we asked him, we said, is there a McDonald's nearby? And you could just tell. This is like, oh. Now, there was a McDonald's just on the other side of the grass, basically, just a very short walk. I don't think this guy had ever been there, that you walk into the National Gallery of Art and be so lowbrow as to actually eat at McDonald's, which is just unthinkable to this guy. So, anyway, I just think of that in this context. So, work for the Smithsonian Institute believes that in 25 years, somewhere between 75 and 80% of all species of living animals will be extinct. Okay? Again, this is a statement made back in the 1970s. The last one of these I'll read, and I've skipped over several. Kenneth Watt warned about a pending ice age in a speech. Now, I remember this. Do you remember this? In the 1970s, on magazines like Newsweek and Time, I think Newsweek had this. You'd find those magazines, and I suppose you still, well, today when you check out, there's gum and candy, right? But there's some magazines still there. But you'd check out, you know, and you'd see the magazines, and Newsweek had a picture on the magazine, and it was a feature article, probably a number of articles, where they were warning against and predicting a coming ice age. This is in the 1970s. Now then, what happened to that, and how did that narrative change?
Global warming.
Global warming, which eventually fell out of favor, and now we more often talk about climate change, okay? But in the 1970s, they were predicting a coming ice age. And they predicted, why did they predict that? It's a really obvious answer.
They say that it's cyclical. They'll get really, really, really hot. The Earth will not be able to sustain such heat that it will initiate by itself a cooling down period and freeze as much as it can. And then it will slowly warm up, warm up, warm up, warm up, warm up, and repeat.
And I'm going to make just a more basic, maybe retarded answer to why they said that. Over a series of years, they simply tracked temperature, and the temperatures were falling. Okay? Temperature was going down, and so they said there's a potential ice age coming. And then that changed, and then temperature started going up. So Kenneth Watt warned about a pending ice age in his speech. The world has been chilling sharply for about 20 years, he declared. If present trends continue, the world will be about 4 degrees colder for the global mean temperature in 1990, but listen to this, 11 degrees colder in the year 2000. This is about twice what it would take to put us into an ice age. Now, by the way, people today that talk about climate change, I mean, they talk about, you know, the worst case scenarios that the temperature might go up a degree or 2. This person was saying that temperatures would plummet 11 degrees. And so I'll just stop and take any comments you have before going forward on this whole issue of climate change fears. And then what should we take from this? What does this mean? And how does it help us to maybe think about what's going on today? Any comments on any of that?
It seems like the big fallacy is unless God is behind a man, they can prophesy. And people cannot prophesy. And the other thing is they tend to think in terms of stasis, that their
of stasis.
Is not dynamic. And the human mind is not dynamic. You know, there's no interaction. It's, when you look back on that, it's such foolish thinking, and yet it's repeated over and over and over.
Hey, Seasai, would you go get my Kindle? It's in my office between the 2 chairs. It's plugged in charging. Would you bring that to me? Dan. Dan is the closest thing. I shouldn't say it that way, because that seems like it diminishes. Well, yes, and he pointed to his wife. Dan and Terry are both veterinarians. Terry is more small animal. Dan is large animal. So their training is basically medical doctor for animals. So think MD type. So Dan and Terry are I think they're the scientists in the room. So I don't know what you're going to say, Dan, but I've set you up to say something profound, okay?
Well, I can't speak. Well, I was going to defend science, actually. So.
Yes, and you know, and I actually had the thought as I was reading all these statements, the thought went through my mind, I wonder, because I think this is important, because I've sort of trashed all these predictions. They're laughable. But I think it's wrong for us to just say that, well, therefore everything science has to say is a joke. That would be equally wrong. So go ahead.
No, so, you know, in our day, you know, we hear continuously the science says, right, in regard to COVID, and I think it's really confused everyone, and in terms of what science is, and I think we need to make a distinction between what is the scientific method, you know, and what scientists who actually use the scientific method, what they do, versus what policymakers do. You know, and so a lot of people quoted, right, are, you know, they have a role, they have they are scientists, but they also have a dual role in terms of policy making, right? And so, you know,
and the intergovernmental panel coming out of the UN is it's more political.
Absolutely. But
yes.
The way, you know, there's the science, the true science frequently is way behind. So let's use COVID as an example. The real science in terms of what we know is actually quite behind where policymakers need to be, okay? And there's no other way, that, by the nature of it, that's just how it is. You know, it was really interesting when the CDC recently came out, you know, they said we won't need the mask, and then it was only several days later we're going to need the mask. And that had everything, you know what that had to do with? A lot of reports coming out of Israel, right? But no, what's coming out of Israel is more scientific. There's more, that's real knowledge, and it has a little bit more scientific weight, okay? But it wasn't known until those reports were coming out, right? And so you have policymakers trying to make policy, and they don't know. They act like they know, but they're called upon to make a decision based on what we have. As medical people have to do this all the time. You're presented with a case, and you can't necessarily go back into the literature and find a study about this exact case. It's not there. But we're called upon to make a decision based on what is there, right? And so you're continuously extrapolating out of what we know from good scientific method into what we don't know, right? And that's what, and I think that's where it gets confused. And so, you know, I don't want, we shouldn't have a, what would you say, complete disdain for science, what science says, because it gets thrown around and the distinction needs to be made. There are, you know, science is not any different than any other discipline. It involves intellectual honesty, and frequently scientists need to say, we don't know. But policymakers can't do that, right? And so they always say, well, science says this. And sometimes it doesn't say that, because what's mixed into what policymakers are saying is their own worldview, their own bias, and they're extrapolating from what is known to what is not known.
Yes. And I think it's important to point out too that we'll get to this later. I have a book in my library. It's somewhat dated now, but when I read the book, it really rocked my world. And it's written by a policymaker, and the title kind of just gives the book away. The title is Green Power, Black Death. And the thesis of the book is that, and again, this is 10 years ago, the situation in Africa has improved quite a bit. And it's improved because of technology, and that's connected to science. But the argument of the book is basically that environmentalism in its more radical forms is denying to the poorest people on the planet the things that they most desperately need to come up out of poverty. And what they most desperately need is things like clean water and cheap energy. And cheap energy involves often the burning of fossil fuels. And so policymakers putting pressure on African governments to keep those technologies from being in those nations. So the title, Green Power equals Black Death. But the thesis of that book, the other thought in it is that if we're to make progress, it's going to be through, it's really the science is going to lead in that. You know, through crops, and we'll get into genetically modified crops, and I'm sure that someone in this room will think that's a terrible idea. I'll argue in a different direction, at least in part. But so that is a counterbalance And the other thing I would say is that on climate issues, although you don't hear this from the media, and I just think it's pretty dishonest of them, the scientists are not united in what is causing climate change. The media always presents it as, you know, the science is unanimous in its opinion that it's human-induced and human-caused. And that, when you dig into this more, you realize there are lots and lots and lots and lots of scientists who don't support those conclusions. And then you get into the issue, which I think there is some dishonesty in this. If you're a scientist and you're working for the government and you're needing grant monies to keep your career going, it's like the newspaper man. I had a professor in seminary, and his parents had owned a newspaper, and so he'd grown up in that world. And he said, if you're in that world, bad news is good news, because bad news sells newspapers. And the same thing can apply in terms of grant money. Bad news gets you more grant money. Good news, the money dries up. And so there are all sorts of dynamics involved in this. Some of them are somewhat nefarious and others not. But I think everybody agrees that science has a big role to play in, and it has, I mean, things we've said so far, this is true. I mean, the ability to extract oil, the ability to get at resources, those are scientific breakthroughs. And so, all right, Scott, I saw your hand up.
I was just going to say, my mom was 95, and she lived on a farm in Malawi, and she remembers as a kid that her dad would watch the sunset, and a lot of times it would be a big red sunset. And I mean, his thoughts were, you know, I've read in Scripture that, you know, the world will be destroyed. This could be it. You know, I mean, they kind of lived in that understanding that tonight might be the last night. She just remembered that they thought there was a huge fire and the world was on fire. I think it's been with us, because that would have been, you know, back in the 1930s. I think it's been with us.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be stated here about a Christian worldview versus some of the things we're talking about. Young people especially, some of our young people really are deeply afraid that the world's going to end. And they're hearing that through the media, maybe they're hearing it through the school system, and they believe this. And so just simply to speak into this and say, I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's true. There is some climate change taking place. There has been throughout all of human history. And again, we're just starting to get into this. We've got a lot of stuff to look at. But to recognize, along with this, that there is a sovereign God who created and sustains this world. And that God has created this world not as fragile as I think the climate science crowd oftentimes suggests to us. And so to trust God and to trust His providence. And I want to read from Jeremiah 14 as we close. But I've had several of you have hands go up. Harry's hand has gone up a couple times. So go ahead, Harry.
Well, Genesis 22. God said, I'll keep the seed time, harvest, in the cold and heat, in the summer and the winter, and the day and the night shall not cease. So He's still in control. 8:22.
Yeah, so from a Christian worldview perspective, we realize we're stewards of this world, and we'll have a lot to say about that as well. We do have an interest in taking care of this world, but this is God's world. It is not ours. Okay? And we have to answer to Him. And that's a heavy responsibility. But we are given stewardship, and we're called to shepherd the resources of this world, and to take that seriously, but to recognize at the same time that ultimately God is the one who created this world, and God is the one who will preserve this world. As we close, because I want to, we've just got a couple minutes here. This week, or maybe it was last week, I think it was probably this week. I'm reading in Jeremiah, and I was struck by a number of passages in Jeremiah, and I just want to read to you my underlines. That's why I asked Seesaw to get my Kindle, because I read from my Kindle. And as I read this, it's talking, chapter 14 of Jeremiah, it titles it Famine, Sword, and Pestilence. What is pestilence? What's that? COVID-19 is a pestilence, yes. The word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah concerning the drought. So the question is, what has caused this drought? Okay? And we can give a lot of answers to that question, can't we? I'm just interested in how the Bible answers this particular drought that had come upon Judah. Judah mourns, and her gates languish. Her people lament on the ground, and the cry of Jerusalem goes up. Her nobles send their servants for water. They come to the cisterns. They find no water. They return with their vessels empty. They are ashamed and confounded and cover their heads. Now, I remember being in Ethiopia on a Sunday morning in a church and listening to the pastor do the pastoral prayer like we do here, and he is praying for rain because he's saying there are parts of our country where thousands of people are going to die if we don't get rain. Can you imagine that in America? I mean, in America, we get people upset because my lawn is browning out because they won't let me water. At least they do that in Portland. So in this context, drought was a disaster. Because of the ground that is dismayed since there's no rain on the land, the farmers are ashamed, they cover their heads. Even the doe in the field forsakes her newborn fawn because there is no grass. The wild donkeys stand on the bare heights. They pant for air like jackals. Their eyes fail because there is no vegetation. And then verse 7. Though our iniquities testify against us, act, O Lord, for your name's sake. For our backslidings are many. We have sinned against you. Now, according to that text, in this particular example, what caused that drought? The sin of the nation. And so that also would be part of a Christian worldview. And of course, the secular worldview would just scoff at this. But that God would actually bring pestilence and famine and drought and storm into our world as a way of expressing his displeasure for our unrighteousness. And again, the secular world can't even think in those terms. But as Christian people, we should at least be able to recognize that God is sovereign in these things also.
Well, John, to say and that he would do those things as a common grace, encouraging repentance, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Let me just read a couple of verses later. This is so harsh, and this is so unlike what you're saying, Dan, because generally speaking, I agree with what Dan said. In this passage it says, "So the Lord said to me, do not pray for the welfare of this people. Though they fast, I will not hear their cry. And though they offer burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, but I will consume them by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence." Now, the text goes on to speak later, and there's some hope given. But we'll just close with that thought. As we think about these issues, there's so much to consider. But as people of faith, as Christians, we recognize that God also has a part in all of this. Okay? Talked about climate fears, and we'll go on in coming weeks. You see why it's going to take time, because we've only got a short distance on a really important topic. I guess I'll close in prayer. Father God, I do thank you for the day that you've given to us. We ask, Lord, your grace to be upon us. We do rejoice in common grace. And the verses that I just read strike us because they are so unusual. They do remind us, though, that you are a righteous God. So we pray for our nation. We pray that there would be a turning of our people to you. And we pray, Lord, at the same time, as Christian people, as people of faith, we rejoice that there is a Creator. And we rejoice that there is a creation and that we are part of it. And it is a creation filled with wonder. And even in its brokenness, it is filled with beauty. And so I pray that as we continue to walk through these lessons, that we will not lose sight of this. That every sunset and every flower testifies eloquently of your existence, of your wisdom, of your power. And I pray that we would trust you for your sustaining of us. And so we give you glory today. Help us to think right. Help us to think your thoughts. Help our minds to be shaped and formed by your word. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.